June 19, 1944, Philippine Sea, 120 miles west of Saipan. Vice Admiral Jisaburō Ozawa stood on the flag bridge of the carrier Taihō, Japan's newest and most formidable flat top, watching the first wave of his aircraft disappear into the western sky toward the American invasion fleet off Saipan. The morning air tasted of salt and aviation gasoline. Around him, staff officers plotted intercept courses with mechanical precision. Ozawa commanded the mobile fleet, Japan's remaining carrier strength gathered for Operation Eigo, the decisive battle that would reverse 2 years of strategic retreat. He had 9 carriers, 5 battleships including the massive Yamato and Musashi, and 430 aircraft. Intelligence reported that Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded perhaps 7 carriers. Ozawa's plan exploited his aircraft's superior range. His Zeros could strike from distances American planes could not match, allowing him to attack while remaining beyond enemy retaliation. What Ozawa did not know was that Spruance commanded not 7 carriers, but 15. 7 fleet carriers and 8 light carriers, operating in 4 task groups with coordination Japanese forces could no longer achieve. Ozawa also did not know that American combat air patrols, guided by radar tracking incoming strikes 100 miles distant, were already vectoring toward his aircraft with systematic precision. In approximately 6 hours, 350 of Ozawa's 430 aircraft would be shot down in what American pilots would mockingly call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Ozawa would learn that Japanese naval doctrine, tactics, and expectations had become comprehensively obsolete against an American naval force combining overwhelming numbers, superior technology, and operational methods that represented fundamental transformation in carrier warfare. The story of what Japanese admirals said when they faced America's carrier task forces is the chronicle of a naval power systematically overwhelmed, not merely by numbers, but by doctrine, innovation, and industrial capacity that produced qualitative superiority alongside quantitative dominance. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the Pacific War with arguably the world's most effective carrier force. 6 fleet carriers operated with tactical precision, launching the strike on Pearl Harbor that demonstrated carrier aviation had superseded battleships as the decisive naval weapon. Japanese naval aviators were superbly trained, their Zero fighters superior to early war American aircraft. From December 1941 through March 1942, Japanese carrier forces operated with near impunity across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. But the Battle of Midway in June 1942, where 4 Japanese fleet carriers were sunk, marked the inflection point where American industrial production and doctrinal innovation began to overwhelm Japan's initial advantages. By mid-1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy faced American carrier task forces that bore almost no resemblance to the force that had scraped together 3 carriers at Midway. The transformation was so comprehensive that Japanese naval leadership struggled to comprehend its implications until confronted with defeat so absolute that continued resistance became mathematically futile. Japanese admirals had expected to fight a war of attrition where superior training and tactics would compensate for industrial inferiority. They expected decisive battle, the concept enshrined in Japanese naval doctrine since Admiral Togo's victory at Tsushima in 1905, where concentrated forces would achieve strategic victory in a single climactic engagement. What they did not expect was the speed and scale of American naval reconstruction, the doctrinal innovations that multiplied carrier effectiveness, and the emergence of carrier task forces that operated as integrated systems rather than collections of individual ships. American carrier doctrine evolved rapidly through combat experience. The Essex-class fleet carriers that began commissioning in 1943 incorporated lessons learned: better damage control, more effective anti-aircraft armament, improved aviation facilities that increased sortie rates. But more important was the development of task force organization that treated multiple carriers as a single tactical entity. American carrier groups operated with dedicated escorts configured specifically for anti-aircraft defense and submarine screening. Fighter direction officers aboard radar-equipped ships controlled combat air patrols with radio communication that allowed dynamic response to threats. By 1944, a single American carrier task group possessed more defensive capability than the entire Japanese mobile fleet, could maintain continuous combat air patrol through shift rotations impossible with Japan's limited aircraft and pilot numbers, and could coordinate strikes involving hundreds of aircraft with precision Japanese forces could no longer match. The technological disparity compounded numerical inferiority. American radar could detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles and distinguish individual formations with accuracy sufficient for precise fighter direction. Japanese radar remained primitive and often unreliable. Most Japanese carriers in the Philippine Sea battle had no functioning air search radar at all. American fighter pilots flew improved Grumman F-6F Hellcats that matched or exceeded the Zero's maneuverability while offering superior speed, firepower, and critically, armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks that allowed them to absorb damage and survive. The Zero, designed for extreme range through weight minimization, remained lightly built and vulnerable. Hits that would damage a Hellcat typically resulted in the Zero exploding catastrophically. Japanese pilot quality had deteriorated catastrophically since 1942. The veteran aviators who had attacked Pearl Harbor were mostly dead, lost in the grinding attrition of the Solomons and New Guinea, where Japan's inability to replace losses meant each casualty permanently degraded capability. By 1944, Japanese carrier pilots averaged less than 3 months of training compared to 2 years for their predecessors, and they faced American pilots with increasing combat experience and superior training programs that American industrial capacity could sustain indefinitely. The Battle of the Philippine Sea unfolded with mathematical inevitability once American radar detected the incoming Japanese strikes. Task Force commanders had complete situational awareness through radar plots showing Japanese formations approaching from the west. American carriers launched additional fighters, stacking combat air patrols at different altitudes. Fighter direction officers vectored interceptors toward the incoming strikes with precision. The first Japanese attack wave, consisting of 69 aircraft, was intercepted 50 miles from the American fleet by over 40 Hellcat fighters. The engagement was one-sided slaughter. Of the 69 Japanese aircraft, only 20 reached visual range of American ships, and most were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire. Only one hit was achieved, a bomb on the battleship South Dakota causing minimal damage. Similar massacres awaited the second, third, and fourth Japanese strike waves throughout the day. The few Japanese aircraft that survived found their torpedoes ineffective against American damage control practices. The symbolic sound that came to haunt Japanese naval communications was radio silence, the absence of contact from strike waves that never returned. The growing realization aboard Japanese flagships that aircraft were being destroyed faster than they could be launched. Ozawa received fragmentary reports of many enemy fighters and intense anti-aircraft fire, then silence as entire formations were annihilated. The silence of non-returning aircraft became more than operational difficulty. It represented the collapse of the fundamental equation upon which Japanese carrier operations depended. Carriers without aircraft were merely floating targets, and Japan's limited industrial capacity meant lost aircraft could not be quickly replaced. Lost pilots were irreplaceable. The training pipeline was broken, disrupted by American submarine interdiction of fuel supplies, by loss of training facilities, by the simple fact that Japan no longer had time for multi-year training programs. The actual words spoken by Japanese admirals, preserved in war diaries and post-war interrogations, reveal progressive realization of catastrophic disadvantage. After the first strike wave was decimated, Ozawa received reports describing American fighter swarms that outnumbered Japanese attack aircraft, electronic detection providing warning before visual contact, coordination suggesting the Americans knew Japanese plans in advance. As the second and third waves reported similar conditions, the realization grew that something fundamental had changed. Rear Admiral Sueo Obayashi, commanding Carrier Division 3, sent a message after recovering survivors. Enemy fighter direction and numbers far exceed intelligence estimates. Our attacks are being intercepted with precision, suggesting radar guidance. Recommend suspension of further strikes. The recommendation was rejected. Japanese doctrine demanded continued attack, but Obayashi's assessment was accurate. The destruction was not limited to Japanese aircraft. Midway through the battle, the American submarine Albacore torpedoed Taihō. The hit seemed initially minor, but aviation gasoline vapor from ruptured fuel lines gradually filled the ship's interior, and 7 hours later, the accumulated fumes ignited in a catastrophic explosion that tore the ship apart, sinking Japan's newest carrier with over 1,600 men. The submarine Kavala torpedoed and sank the carrier Shōkaku, a Pearl Harbor veteran, the same day. The loss of 2 fleet carriers to submarine attack while simultaneously losing 90% of embarked aircraft represented compound disaster. Ozawa, transferred to another carrier after Taihō's sinking, sent a situation report to combined fleet headquarters that evening. The mobile fleet had been effectively destroyed as an offensive force. The following day's American counterattack, the strike that sank one carrier and damaged several others in what became known as Mission Beyond Darkness, demonstrated another dimension of American superiority. Admiral Mitcher's decision to launch despite knowing recovery would occur after dark reflected confidence in American pilots' training and the task force's ability to absorb losses while maintaining effectiveness. Japanese carrier operations could not accept comparable risks. Mitcher's famous order to turn on the lights, illuminating the entire task force to guide returning aircraft, reflected confidence born of abundance, confidence that sufficient destroyers screened against submarines, that enough aircraft remained for dawn patrols, that losses would not cripple the force. For Japanese observers, it represented a philosophy of warfare where material resources enabled aggressive operations that forces under scarcity constraints could not attempt. The transformation in Japanese naval leadership's understanding accelerated after the Philippine Sea. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commanding Combined Fleet, had ordered Operation Ego, expecting decisive victory. The outcome: 3 carriers sunk, 2 damaged, approximately 600 aircraft lost, and negligible damage inflicted on American forces, forced recognition that Japan had lost the capacity to contest American naval dominance. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 saw remnants of Japanese carrier forces deployed as decoys to draw American carriers away while surface forces attempted to attack landing areas. The plan reflected desperation. Japanese carriers sailed with minimal aircraft, serving as bait whose expected destruction was planned into the operation. Admiral Ozawa later wrote that he understood his mission was sacrificial. Our purpose was to be sunk while drawing away the enemy carriers. We were not expected to survive. The industrial dimension underlying this transformation was staggering. American shipyards commissioned over 20 Essex-class fleet carriers, and more than 70 escort carriers between 1943 and 1945. Japanese shipyards completed 3 fleet carriers during the same period, and 2 were sunk before becoming operational. American naval aviation trained over 60,000 pilots using programs that progressively incorporated combat lessons. Japan's training programs, disrupted by fuel shortages and loss of facilities, graduated pilots with barely adequate basic skills. The result was qualitative disparity that multiplied quantitative inferiority. The kamikaze attacks that characterized the final year represented Japanese naval leadership's explicit acknowledgement that conventional operations were hopeless. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who organized the first special attack units, stated the rationale with terrible clarity. "Our skilled pilots are gone. Replacements lack the training to survive against American fighters. A pilot who crashes his bomb-laden aircraft into an enemy ship cannot miss and cannot be stopped by fighter defense once committed. Suicide attack is the only method by which our remaining forces can inflict meaningful damage." Kamikaze attacks were horrifying but militarily ineffective in strategic terms. They sank fewer ships per pilot than conventional attacks by trained aviators would have achieved, could not halt American advances, and accelerated the collapse of Japanese naval aviation. Their adoption marked Japanese acceptance that they could no longer contest American carrier task forces through conventional operations. The statements made by Japanese admirals in the war's final months reveal men grappling with catastrophic strategic failure while bound by military code that made acknowledging defeat nearly impossible. Admiral Matome Ugaki wrote in his diary, "We send 20 aircraft against 150 enemy fighters. The outcome is foreordained. Yet we must continue attacking because the alternative is surrender, which our code cannot accept. We are defeated men executing the motions of war after defeat has become certain." Rear Admiral Toshitane Takata, captured after the war, told American officers that Japanese naval leadership had understood by early 1944 that the carrier war was lost, that American production had created insuperable numerical advantage, but that political considerations and military culture prevented strategic withdrawal. To propose ending the war would be to accept responsibility for defeat, which no officer could survive politically or in some cases physically. So we continued operations we knew were futile. By war's end, American carrier task forces operated in sight of the Japanese home islands, launching strikes against Japanese airfields and industrial targets with impunity, virtually unchallenged by Japanese forces that had been reduced to ineffectiveness. The images of American carriers launching strikes against Japan while Japanese carriers sat pierside, unable to sortie for lack of fuel, aircraft, or trained pilots, visually summarize the complete reversal in Pacific naval power. The post-war interrogations reveal men struggling to reconcile their professional competence with comprehensive strategic failure. Admiral Ozawa provided perhaps the most comprehensive assessment. "We were defeated by industrial capacity we could not match, technological innovation we could not replicate, and operational methods we did not anticipate. Your carrier task forces represented a transformation in naval warfare that our doctrine did not account for. We continued fighting with tactics appropriate to a previous era, while you created new methods suited to industrial modernity." The symbolic silence, the radio silence of non-returning aircraft, the silence of Japanese carriers that could no longer launch strikes, the silence from combined fleet headquarters that had no further operations to order, became deafening by 1945. American carrier task forces sailed where they wished, struck what they chose, operated as though Japanese forces no longer existed as meaningful opposition. The transformation from December 1941, when Japanese carriers struck Pearl Harbor, to August 1945, when American carriers launched strikes against the Japanese home islands, represented complete reversal achieved through systematic application of industrial capacity, technological innovation, and doctrinal evolution. What Japanese admirals said when they faced America's carrier task forces evolved from confident expectation to shocked realization to resigned acknowledgement. But the underlying narrative remained constant. They had miscalculated American capability, underestimated industrial capacity, and failed to anticipate how rapidly American forces would transform carrier operations. The silence of non-returning aircraft became not merely tactical problem, but strategic verdict. The acoustic embodiment of mathematical reality that no amount of fighting spirit could reverse. Japanese naval tradition, with its emphasis on decisive battle and individual excellence, proved insufficient against an opponent who approached warfare as an industrial problem to be solved through systematic application of resources. The admirals who commanded Japan's remaining naval forces in the war's final year understood they were presiding over institutional death, ordering operations that could not succeed, expending lives in demonstrations of continued resistance that had no strategic purpose beyond postponing the surrender that mathematics had already decreed. Their statements testified to a truth about modern warfare: that carrier forces, properly organized and adequately supported by industrial production, represent concentration of power that can control vast oceanic expanses, and that nations challenging such superiority without equivalent capability embark on strategic courses where courage cannot substitute for production capacity, where defeat becomes not possible but certain, and where the silence of lost aircraft echoes long after guns fall silent.